Okay, so this is going to be fun. I'm going to be moving at a pretty decent clip because otherwise I'll get bored with my own presentation. So my name is Chase. This is how I look when I'm full of coffee and I want to talk about marketing and marketing APIs. So the title of this talk actually came from this book, and it talks about how developers have progressed in the world from being pawns to moving into being kings of the organization. So basically this importance and kind of how they have created so much more power in the organization as far as not only strategic direction but also purchasing power as far as if you're marketing your products and your APIs to developers. And also if you're not treating your APIs like a product, we should talk about that later. But the question for me comes up is, well, what about a queen, right? So if you're thinking on the chessboard, if you're going from a pawn to a king, you only have a couple more spaces, and actually you're more vulnerable in the end. And so when you think about queens, they actually have a lot more power on the chessboard. And they're actually the full stack player when you think about chess as far as moving front end to back end. But finding these people in your organization can be a little bit tough. So finding the right people, the right developers, the right influencers in the organization to talk to them about your products and your APIs can be a little bit challenging. And so in this discussion, we're going to be talking about how to do that effectively in the field. And here's Waldo for those who are trying to find him while I was talking. So we're going to be talking about developer marketing. But we're going to be talking about developer marketing in the field. And the reason is that developers really like to get together. They like to get together in real life, right? So they like to come together a little bit and avoid the trolls of online. You know, Stack Overflow is great, but it doesn't solve all the problems in the world, right? So you really want to connect to each other. And so I actually have a question for the audience. How many developer events do you go to throughout the year, right? So I'll start with 2 because this counts as 1, right? So how many go to at least 2 a year? 3 a year? 4 a year? 20? That's true. And so when I was running global developer marketing, we did a session with Forrester, and we actually found that a lot of developers will average around 3 events per year, right? And so when you're thinking about anything from meetups to local conferences to larger regional conferences such as this, to even larger conferences like on the language and platform side where it's thousands and even tens of thousands. And so this session is really about my lessons learned from attending, organizing, and running a lot of those events. So that way it better informs your marketing department's design, right, when it comes to development patterns. And so here's just a quick list of some of the events that I've either attended, run things in the past. They vary in size, but also location and country. And the way that I've broken it down is the largest, which is the language and platform conferences, right? And so these are the AWS reInvents, these are the GitHub Universes, the DockerCons of the world. There's also regional conferences, so I'd actually lump Nordic APIs into this, but these are the conferences that pull together a region, and they don't have to be platform or technology specific. And there's also hackathons, so I'll talk a little bit more about how I approach hackathons, and then also local conferences and meetups. And how you approach it in the mix really depends on your budget, right? So this kind of comes back to the marketing of like, well, what's the budget start with? But that's actually the wrong question, is it's more of who is your user and how are you going to be approaching them? And because when you think about a user, and coming back to the chess analogy, is even though we're all kind of playing on the same board, how we approach it is going to be very different, right? As far as the skill sets we use, whether it's front end, back end, different types of technologies. And also the buyer, right? So sometimes the buyer is the user. And that way you're actually pretty fortunate because your go-to-market is going to be very similar. But in a lot of cases, it's not. It could be a mix, right? And so sometimes your buyer is actually someone who carries the wallet, but the user actually doesn't actually play with the software until the contract has already been signed. And sometimes you just don't know. Sometimes it really is a mix in the organization. Sometimes you have really technical architects. Sometimes you don't. So the first lesson I'm going to talk about what kind of language and platform. So this was actually from GitHub Universe last year. And one of the things that we actually decided to pull our sponsorship, nothing against GitHub, but we actually decided to funnel our money into a party instead. Because the reason being is that we were actually able to control the tone and the conversation at that party a little bit better. And another thing is that just developers and alcohol really go well together. And so the developers' like marketing defenses are all the way up here, right? They've been oversold to. They do not want to talk about it. But when you invite them to a party, the defenses come down a little bit more, right? Because it's not so much going up to a booth in a conference because it's a very expected environment. But when you're out in a social gathering, it's a completely different ballgame, and you actually play the rules a little bit better. So speak at a party if you can't speak at a booth. We also did this at South by Southwest, but that's a little bit different. So regional conferences. So here's actually a snapshot from Web Expo, and this is in Prague. And so whenever I put together a regional event, usually called the developer kit, right? And so this kit is whatever you can fit on a 6-foot table that has your logo, hand out some swag and things like that. And when I used to run them, you notice that the one thing that here is missing is actually the product, right? So actually I have a Pac-Man instead. And there's a very specific reason why we did that. And so that way people actually come up and interact with us first, and then we'd show the product second. Because odds are they may or may not be the best fit for that product. So worst case scenario, they had a great brand touch with the logo. And then if we were able to sell them a product, great. And so what you really want to do is have unexpected experiences, right? Something different, because like I said, it's very systematic as far as people approach something. They expect to be sold, give me some collateral, and move on. But if you're able to switch that up, then it really plays in your favor. And also have good swag. And so I'm going to take, here's kind of a snapshot of that in theory. So I'm going to talk about swag a little bit, but I'm going to talk about one piece of swag in particular, which is a t-shirt. So every time I go to a conference, because my wife is not in the technology industry, she comes back, she always asks a question of how many t-shirts I came back with, right? Because that's kind of the one piece of swag that will always be through. And so I had to sit down and kind of think about why t-shirts are so important in this industry. And so here's what I came up with, and you can let me know if you agree with it or not in the question. But basically, we all have this piece of article of clothing that we have, right? And so it's either a funny t-shirt, so I'm wearing a funny t-shirt right now. It could be a team, it could be a certain brand that you're associating yourself with. And so the idea is to take your brand and kind of create that memorable experience with that person, right? So it's more of a challenge. So when you're actually handing out that swag or whatever it is, or that t-shirt, make sure that there's an experience around it. So that way, that's going to be the determining factor of how long it lasts in your closet. So I'm going to talk about hackathons here. And I'm going to actually break up hackathons into two senses. So there's an internal hackathon and then an external hackathon. So an internal hackathon is actually your team, right? So your own internal development team, if you give them some time off to go play and tinker with whatever they want. But then also your customers. So I've actually ran this pretty successfully in a private group within customers. So here are some rules that I came up as far as having healthy hackathons that are for internally in your teams. So here's actually a snapshot of what we did with American Express. Here's a few others that I did. So American Express was about 80 people. EMC, it's about like 140 folks in those two different time zones. We actually had really smaller ones with Intel. We ran them more frequently though, because they're such an important person within our revenue stream, right? And so it was actually it was made a business decision to reduce churn. So rule number one is safe pitches. And by this I mean no secret backlogs, right? So people really have to come to the table with a project that they're passionate about and not something that the product manager just wants to get them to do over the weekend. Corollary to this is that everyone demos. You can work on whatever you want, but know that you have the pressure that you have to present to your peers and then also superiors. And this plays into stack the judges. So get the most executive person you can to be a judge. And what this does, it creates a two-way street. So it allows the executives to see who within the organization is hungry and wants to come and play. And it also allows people who might be, quote unquote, at the bottom, access to those higher levels of strategy. It's not just for engineers, right? So bring in your product people, bring in your UX people, bring in some marketing people, bring in some designers. Part of winning a hackathon is making sure that its product not only works, but it actually looks okay. This one's more self-explanatory, so there's just been a trend away from energy drinks and pizza more into like actual food, just because we're all humans. And really the expensive part is over. So the most expensive part is actually taking your engineering team off of your product roadmap for a day or a week or however long that might be. And so don't skimp on the good stuff, right? So get that nice food, get the venue, get whatever it needs to have a successful event. And also timing, right? So even the best planned hackathons, if they run 3 hours over, that's what people are going to remember, not so much the prizes. So we're going to switch gears a little bit more into external hackathons. And so these are a little bit more common what you see in the wild, so I'm not going to spend as much time here, but just some things that I've noticed over time. And so here's one of the larger hackathons that happens out in California. I think this was about 1,000 people. And so if you are approaching a hackathon either from a sponsorship, one thing I'll mention is use cash if you're trying to solve business problems, because then you're going to attract the teams who really want to develop solutions. There's actually this notion of a professional hackathon team. I was a part of one, and it usually consists of a back-end person, front-end person, a UX or a design person, and a pitchman. And so that's usually a group of 4 or 5 people that will go to various different hackathons just for the cash money, right? And they're really out there to solve problems to the spec of what the organization has. The other corollary to this is use prizes if you really want to develop passion, and because really that's a side effect of good learning. So use prizes if you really want people just to get engaged and learn with your product and just discover more. So a little bit about local meetups. There's an etiquette to meetups that I want to talk about, because I think a lot of people, either new marketing people or salespeople, just run into meetups because they're like, oh, that's where the developers are. We should really talk about it. So there are some ground rules if you're coming into meetups. So the first is be yourself. Don't be the product. Right? You're there to be your own person and kind of help them along that journey. And so don't oversell yourself, right? So come in, be nice, present it. Your role there is actually to help people. It's help the meetup, right? So be that person that provides food, be that person that provides a venue, be that person that provides access to speakers, because that's really the support that that group needs in order to move forward, and that's how you're going to get brand loyalty. And when the question comes up, be that person and kind of help coach them along, right? So really coach them to help solve their problem and provide solutions. If your product just so happens to be the right solution for their problem, that's great, and you can talk to them about that. And that's really what you want to set yourself up as, but you're not there to oversell. And so I want to take this moment and actually really come back to, we've been talking a lot about field, but I want to come back to digital, right? Because they really do come together. They're supposed to amplify each other. Right? So having a good developer advocate is not an excuse for bad documentation, right? You shouldn't have a person out in the field to explain the documentation that should be self-readable. And so when you work together between kind of the field and the digital experiences, you should create this cohesive experience, right? And so if you can actually convince someone to go to that URL that you've been talking about, it should carry on the conversation without you. Otherwise, it's not scalable. So, thank you. So I'm Chase. I'm a product marketing manager at Cloud Elements. We actually offer embeddable API integrations. And so you can reach out to me here. And I'm also on the Twitter spheres. And then the last slide is just a pitch. We're actually organizing API Days USA out in Denver next year, so mark your calendars. Thank you.